Good evening, everyone. This is the Planning Board meeting, September 19th, 2023. First of all, I'm going to introduce the Planning Board members. My name is Kathy Barnard, and I'll go down to my left, Steve Webster, sitting next to, Steve is an alternate. Sitting next to Steve is Von Dugan, then Peter Goodwin, Roger Murray, Doug Breskin, who is the Vice Chairman of the Planning Board. To my right, John Thurston, and Brad Harriman, who is the Board of Selectmen's representative to the Planning Board, and Julie Jacobs, who is also an alternate. Okay, there are no public hearings. This is just basically a work session. So the first item on the agenda is the shorefront regulations. We discussed, the last time we discussed this was December 18th. I asked all of you to bring here your draft or whatever you had made notes on from the 18th. Then there was a change that Rich Massey made based on comments made by Julie Jacobs saying that we should have something for smaller projects. Also attached to the memo that I sent to you was something that says new proposal. And this was something that Rich Massey had given to us at the 18th, December 8th, July 18th meeting. And John, you said you didn't have it, so I thought I'd better send it along. Then the next item basically just talks about Rich's shorefront lot improvement standards. That's 67A1, and he added wording saying 225 square feet or more of impervious surface, a plan survey or letter of certification prepared by the appropriate professional is required to establish the percent of impervious lot coverage. So basically, all I'm trying to do is move this along, make sure that everybody's on the same page, and so that we can then ultimately set it for a public hearing.
I think if we want to move this along efficiently, we, because of the errors that were in the package that were sent out and that did not include changes that were made at our last discussion, that I believe Rich Massey has something that he prepared following the July 18th meeting, which incorporates what we discussed back then, and it would be much more fruitful to discuss that instead of language part of which we discarded.
Okay, well, if people want to do that, I had sent Rich an email earlier today and said that this is a work session. This is a time for the planning board to just discuss issues so that we're all sort of on the same page. So, but Roger, if you'd like to make a motion or something, I mean, we generally do not accept things from people at work sessions, but we certainly can. And I also told Rich that he could speak during the public session. So anyway,
well, there's no reason why we can't accept information pertinent to what we're discussing at a work session. So I would like to make a motion that we ask Rich to provide us with copies of the documents that he brought with him so that we're all on the same page, and that they include basically starting from the point we're at now, instead of mixing what we discarded and multiple other copies.
Oh, okay, the reason I didn't suggest that Rich give it to us tonight is because it's really hard for people when you get something at a meeting and then are trying to read it. But That's your motion. Somebody want to second that?
I wish Roger would speak in front of the mic just a little bit better. I didn't really catch a lot of that.
I'll repeat it.
Can you lower your mic a little, Roger? That
Sure.
probably would help.
Is that better?
Yes.
Much better.
I'm making a motion that we invite Rich Massey to present us with a document that he prepared following the discussion on July 18th, which incorporates what was discussed then. What was in the packet includes misinformation, erroneous information, and then we now have a stack of proposals in front of us. And it's some question about which one we should be looking at. And I think that if Rich would present those to us, we will all be talking about the same thing. And it would include the changes we discussed at the last meeting, which the document that Kathy referred to as new proposal 17567 does not.
Okay, well, it was presented. Does somebody want to second the motion?
Well, before I second it, Roger, I'd just like to clarify what your motion is. I believe what you're saying is that the information included in the packets given to the planning board contain outdated or erroneous information, and that Rich is in possession of what essentially is a corrected or updated version. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Is there going to be a way to see what the differences are in what was there before and this new proposal?
If you look at what we discussed on the 18th, you should be able to compare that with the what Rich has.
I'm not comfortable trying to read something right now tonight and then talk about it without having a chance to actually sit down and read an 8-page document.
Also, it seems like the proposed changes should show, I mean, I have an old version that has green things crossed out, red things added. This is a consolidation of what a person thinks should be the now discussion, but usually the planning board has crossed out items, suggested changes, not updated by someone else, so that we can compare documents equally.
Okay, someone want to second Roger's motion?
I'll second the motion. I don't see any reason why we can't accept the information, even though we may not be able to act on it this evening.
Okay, well, just as long as everybody knows where I was coming from, I was trying to be sensitive to something that has sort of become confusing and not put something else on the table right now. But anyway.
So this document that Rich is going to discuss, it has erroneous or irrelevant information previous to the document that we're going to get from Rich. Is what you just...
I believe what was in the packet is not what was provided to the planning department by Rich. Somehow in the planning department it seems to have gotten...
Okay, so when we get Rich's document, how are we going to integrate that into the final document?
Well, it's a complete, from section 175-62 down through section 165-67, 175-67. And as far as I could tell, it incorporates some of the discussion the last time. There were sections that were on the 18th, which we felt should be eliminated. There was some language that we felt, I think there was a consensus should be changed, and Rich's document incorporates that. What we received in our package does not consistently do that.
Okay, so is Rich's document up for discussion and changes also?
Yes. It would give us a
It's-
basis to discuss
it's the-
that, discuss
The latest one
basically.
that Rich put together, I think.
It would discuss where we are now and make changes going forward.
If I understand it correctly, I believe that the document that Rich has now is a step further along than what was included in our packets. Is that right?
Yes, it's also coherent.
It's also what?
Coherent.
Okay. All right, motion has been made and seconded to allow Rich to give us the information tonight. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Okay, opposed?
No.
Okay, and I'll abstain. Okay, Rich. Okay, are you just going to give it to us?
I thought he was going to distribute it, not talk about it.
Yeah, that's what I thought too.
Turn.
We really need the microphone. We need the
We
microphone.
Need the microphone.
Turn it on.
There you go.
All right, I just want to remind the board of what actually transpired. We were all here, well, with the exception of Peter and Vaughn, on July 18th. At the end of that very lengthy discussion, there was some agreement that I could go back and try to summarize the discussion that had taken place that evening. I don't know if anybody remembers anything differently, but that is my recollection of how that discussion ended.
Right, and that's
That
what
was Jul-
we've submitted to the, in the packet tonight.
Right. So July 18th, I was asked at the end of the meeting to go back, try to summarize what we had said. And in a couple of cases, I marked out areas where it wasn't clear that there had been any consensus. On July 19th, very next day, Kathy sent me an email and asked for the document that summarized that discussion, and I provided it that day. The email said that it was going to be used in a discussion with Doug and Tavis. And so it was my expectation that what would be in your folders tonight would be that document that I had been asked to submit, possibly with some comments from Doug and Tavis and anybody else, possibly not. I have no way of knowing what went on in
No,
that conversation.
we haven't had any discussion about this.
Okay, so that discussion with Doug and Tavis apparently never took place. So I would expect, I don't know your internal workings, but what I would have expected, based on the discussion we had on July 18th, was that I would provide the board, through Kathy, that summary document that we agreed I would prepare, and that would be the starting point for the next discussion, which is tonight. And that's what I have here.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Am I?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so everybody has it, and do you want to go through this document that we have right now?
No? I'm not going to
Yes.
sit here and read it.
Okay,
The only,
well, basically, it's pretty much the same if you take the 718 and look at this.
the only concern I have for board members that aren't fluent in this section is that this does not provide the track changes between the current existing language and the proposed. This is,
Like that.
well, that's what's in the other one, but that's not what's in what was just handed out, correct?
Yeah, so it makes it difficult to understand what was changed.
Correct. Without going back and forth between the two documents.
Yes.
Right. Well, that's why I
So
suggested
I-
that everybody
I-
bring their 718.
I can pass down, I mean, this having a consolidated version is fine, but I can pass down what I would have expected to see, at least with it, which is something we had too. Yeah, the one with red and green, this is crossed out, this is new. So, okay, you don't have to pass it. Sorry. Just saying.
Okay, do you want to go start through Rich's, since we have it? Or not?
Yes.
Well, as this is a work session, I don't see any reason why we
Yeah.
can't start going through it, although I
Right.
don't know if we'll be able to finalize it this evening.
Yeah, okay, well, yeah. We might very well not. Okay, so the first page, there's nothing.
On 175-64, as Doug pointed out at the last discussion, if it goes 75 to 99 feet, and then goes from 100 feet to 149, so if you have 99 and a half feet, there's a gap.
Yeah, and I would say the way to correct that is you would say 75 up to 100 feet, or up to and not including, or up to and less than 100 feet.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that
Right.
should follow on for C as well and D.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's a minor change just to make sure that there's no gaps in it.
So what happens at 75 feet?
Stays
If it's
the
less than
same.
75 feet,
Well, A is less than 75 feet. B is 75 to less than 100, perhaps is the proper wording. And then C would be 100 to less than 150. And then D would be 150 feet or more.
I think we used the greater than, less than sign before.
It doesn't matter to me. It's as long as we don't have any gaps. I'm not particular about how it's phrased.
Okay, all right. Okay. Let's see, the next page. There are no changes.
Is B relevant because that's how height occurs anyway in the ordinance? Top of page 2.
Okay,
is what?
Say that again, is it relevant what?
Paragraph B is not necessarily relevant because that's controlled by the definition of height, which says the same thing. Just something to think about. It doesn't hurt to be in, but it's just superfluous.
And it makes it difficult to keep track of if it's controlled in more than one place.
right. So are you saying this should stay?
Just something for the board to discuss.
No, what Tavis is suggesting is perhaps B should be removed since height is controlled elsewhere.
Oh, we should know where it is
Yeah.
first, so we know what it says.
It's not controlled elsewhere.
I think when these, the height, and Vaughn, you proposed this, I think you wanted it in all the districts, didn't you?
It's true, but I think in the zoning ordinance book, the whole thing does mention it in every zone. I don't know if that's necessary. I mean, we could say see building height and reference it somewhere else, but it's repetitive.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what's currently in the ordinance and has been for years.
Must be right.
I'm sorry, Roger, you're saying what's written in B is currently what's in the ordinance and has been for years, is that right?
Correct.
Okay. And Tavis, where else is height specified in the?
Well, it's mentioned in every zone.
Yes.
But it's the same in every zone. So one of the things the board could consider would simply be to include that as the definition of height, by definition.
Why would we take it out of the shorefront if we're not going to take it out of all the rest of them? I mean, is that what you're proposing?
That's one of the options, is to remove it from each of them. Since every zone is exactly the same, it becomes the Wolfeboro definition of height.
So if somebody was to come to you and say, look, it's not in there, so I can do it, how do you respond to that?
I'm looking beyond just shorefront. I'm just trying to say there's a lot of repetition throughout the ordinance, as though the only section that somebody would pull out is the one that's relevant to them, as opposed to understanding that height in Wolfeboro is held at 30 feet unless it's a 10-12 pitch, excluding belfries, chair towers, cupolas, and things of that sort.
And Tavis, where would you propose we include the definition of height, if not in each district?
The definitions.
In the general definitions?
Correct.
Okay, but we're going to have to do that in every zone.
I know, that scares people, yes.
Yes, what Tavis is suggesting is we remove it from every zone and only include it in general definitions.
I would be opposed to that. I think you want to
I
make
am
it as
too.
easy to understand as possible, and so that someone looking in particular section would see what the height restriction was in that district,
I agree with
without having to go hunting to section 175, which not everyone would probably realize they had to do.
I would have another perspective on that as well, which is that if we remove it from every district, then we need a warrant article to change every district's
right.
ordinance.
Yes.
And that didn't go so well last
No,
time.
it did not.
I think that's a good point.
Change is hard, yes. Change is hard.
Yet another possible reason not to take it out of the individual sections is if we decide to change one section. Let's say suddenly in town we decided the Avery Bach is the standard, then that's a change, and then we'd have to put these all back. So in light of the fact that in the future things may change, might be wise to keep it in the individual sections.
I also think that if it is explicit in a particular section, somebody who is in this particular area wanting to do things, it is much easier for them to see it, and to add another 5 lines to the ordinance is not really a big deal. So it makes reading this and applying it to your particular case easier, rather than having to go and look for a definition somewhere else in some other particular area.
As I said, it's just a point for discussion.
Okay, well,
Just for reference, all of the rules that apply to shorefront are not in the shorefront regulations, if that is the goal.
Yes, so the shorefront does not stand alone. You still need to follow ordinances elsewhere in the code.
Correct. So if the intent is to put everything possibly applicable to shorefront, is to put it all in shorefront, that is not occurring under the current or existing draft.
okay, seems that some people want to keep it, some people don't want to.
I think it's easier to keep it at this point.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah, I would agree.
I think so, too. Okay, permitted uses, there was nothing in this section. Special,
Can anyone explain C?
It's pretty straightforward.
What was the origin of it? Because that's a completely made-up thing.
Which C?
No building should be closer than 20 feet to any other building on the same lot except for private garages. Yes, it's very plainly written and understandable. I'm just wondering the origin of it, or it's tied to the shorefront regulations.
I believe that's in every district, this provision.
okay,
Except maybe the business.
all right, we're down to permitted uses.
Well, before we go past C, Tavis is asking the origin of it, and
If we're rewriting the shorefront regulations that haven't proven to have any particular issues other than questionable enforcement issues, I'm just wondering what we're gaining without looking at every section of it.
I guess my question is, why do we want to have C included? Is it something that we could remove?
Does it appear everywhere else in the other districts?
It does, except, I'm not sure about the business districts, but it's, I believe, in all the residential districts. And I think its origin may have had something to do with getting fire engines onto lots, but I'm not positive.
So I believe the fire code has more to do with if it's closer than
Can
20.
you speak into your mic, please, Bun?
I think fire code says something like if it's closer than 20 feet to another building, let's say something new to an existing, there's a different kind of fire rating required. But that's in a more elaborate fire code.
In or out, folks?
In.
Okay.
But why?
I don't see it in the Route 28 district. I don't see it in the residential district.
Okay, all I remember is that there were 1, 2, 3, 4 of us on the shorefront regulations the last time we looked at this. And I'm sure that there must have been a reason for that. But I have to go
Well,
back
if
and
it's
look at
new,
that.
I'm just thinking it might be one of those old hang-ons that,
Well, I don't know. We looked pretty closely at just about everything.
and it may have just said, oh, it's been there a long
A
time.
number of months.
And Julie, that's my concern as well. Is it inertia that's keeping it there rather than true need?
Because I'm thinking, like we just looked at this garage that we were thinking about is in the right place, all this other stuff. If it's within 19 feet of the home and the only way to get it more than up to the 20 would mean encroaching on the other, wetlands or something, does 20 feet really make that much of a difference when 19 is as
Okay,
far away
okay.
as they can get?
Well, I think we need more research.
Yeah.
Tavis, can you look in the other residential zones and see if there's any reference to this? And then I'm not sure.
Well, sure. Yes, I will look in all the other zoning districts and work with the building official on what the separation requirements would be. I know, for example, I think, and there are people in the audience that can speak to this, a detached garage doesn't have to be 20 feet from a house. In fact, I think it has to be 3 feet unless there's other
Yeah.
sheetrock provisions in play, but, so I'm
Okay,
really
so-
not trying to be a thorn, I'm just trying to figure out where the 20 feet came from, because that's quite a distance.
Well, I guess you'll have to do some research and figure that out for us.
Yeah, you'd have to probably go back in the minutes, I guess, and find out where it shows up the last place.
I think it's been around for quite a while.
Okay, so can we move on now? Okay. All right, permitted uses, special exception uses.
Well, A needs to include accessory dwelling units. 175-65A.
And ADUs.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to do it the way every other zone does, you make it B, 1 accessory dwelling unit.
I think our goal is to make them all match, isn't it? So that each section is identical as possible?
Well, all I'm going to say is the statute says anywhere you're allowed a single family, you're allowed an ADU, contrary to ZBA actions, but any single family is allowed an ADU.
If we do that, maybe we could add the word attached, because that was
If
especially.
that's a hang-up for folks, yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so you want to include ADUs. Does everybody agree with that? Because I think when we passed this, we said it was, we weren't going to have ADUs, but
Yeah.
the state
I mean,
statute
it's held this long, but I
really says
don't,
that we have to have it.
Yep.
Okay.
it hasn't been tested, but I don't
Yeah.
know if you want to be the ones to test that.
Well, it hasn't been in since we adopted it, so. Okay. All right, boathouses, we're not going to touch that, right?
Yeah.
Special exception uses,
Oh, can I just make one comment on boathouses? The definition here does not match the definition in the definition section. It would probably be good if they did.
Yeah, that was one of last year's changes that didn't survive, was the revised definition. Not that it needs to be revised, but it should at least match from section to definition. I can bring back something that shows them side by side so that you can decide which one you want to keep.
Basically, the difference is, I think the definition says a water structure used solely as a docking facility, and then the rest of it, I think, is the same. Or if it isn't exactly that, it's pretty close to that.
okay. Special exception uses,
So, sorry, back to the
Yep.
boathouse.
okay?
The definition of boathouse, a waterfront building used solely as a docking facility which has a permanent pitched roof with or without sides covering the boat slip or slips. That's it.
Where are you reading that from?
The definitions of the most recent assortment of pages that I was given as a planning book.
So 175 definitions calls boathouse a waterfront building used solely as a docking facility which has a permanent pitched roof with or without sides covering a boat slip or slips.
Does that match the updated one we worked on last year that didn't get passed?
No.
Okay, this is just a clarification.
So 175-65C1, C2 needs to be modified to say used solely as a docking facility, which has. And that would fix it if you want the two to match. Or you could strike two altogether, but that requires people to know where the definitions are in the ordinance when they do a project.
I think we should get the definition out of here.
Well, that was last year's planning board goal, was to get definitions out, but like height, sometimes you want to keep it.
So included in Rich's version, a boathouse must be an accessory structure to the principal permitted structure. That's not in the definition either, so you want to do something about that?
Well, that could be too without the whole foreground of the definition.
That's what's currently in the ordinance, and I'm in favor of not sending people elsewhere to get pertinent information. So I would keep it here and match this definition with the 175 definition.
So other things that come into play, if it's not just a boathouse, it becomes the whole structure, which would negate the boathouse sort of exemption, if you will, for construction within 50 feet. So, does that make sense?
I'm losing some of what you're saying.
If it's not an accessory structure, i.e. a small boat garage down by the water that's separate and distinct from the house, let's say somebody wanted to put their entire house on the edge of the water, you couldn't call that a boathouse just because the boat has a slip. You can't have a garage on both sides of the house, if you will, one for boats and one for cars, because you're not allowed to put a primary structure. You're not allowed to put any structure within 50 feet of the water, but for a boathouse. So it has to remain an accessory structure.
Right.
So that, to me, is the key part of that sentence. The other thing that the board may want to think about, again, may want to think about, 175-65 4D, the state no longer restricts people to 900 square feet for a boathouse. They have a formula. That's one of the reasons the planning board looked at not getting into regulation of boathouses last year, because the state has changed its rules. If you have more frontage, you can have a larger boathouse. If the town wants to hold the line at 900 square feet, that's fine. I'm just telling you, we don't match the state anymore.
I'd hold the line.
I would hold the line.
I agree. As long as the board acknowledges that there is a line and you know you're holding it, that's perfectly fine.
Also, actually, I can show you drawings of boathouses at 900 square feet, and it's a little bit obnoxious because one slip is deep and the other one is shallow, and then there's this jog in the building. It should maybe reflect 2 full-length boat slips and not 900 square feet. And I can show you what that would, I can bring you a boathouse and say, this is what that means, and this is the additional corner of the back that would be allowed for 2 boats.
I've also heard from a builder that was building one who was bitching while he was getting the copies of how unsafe it was that the walkways around, because it was within that square foot, the walkways had to be made that much more narrow, and that every time you moved, you knocked some kid into the water. It was not quite as safe as it used to be, because the boats are bigger.
Well, going back to the definition of a boathouse, is there a reason somebody can only store a boat in a boathouse? Or is there a reason they can't use the boathouse space for something other interior than storage of boats?
Yes.
What?
Well, they morph into, they get refrigerators, they get wall-to-wall carpeting, they get beds.
Okay, I was thinking in terms of a lawn tractor. There are people with much more money than I'll ever be able to conceive of that have no problem putting in a retractable floor so that they can have waterside dining, if you will, and their boats are underneath it. So technically the boats are still stored there, but they do use the structure for things other than docking.
I think once you start stretching it, then it just morphs into something else. If somebody wants to get creative, you're not going out there.
Yeah, I see where you're going, but the people that can afford it are not creating accessory apartments in their boathouse. This is,
But I think what we should be thinking about is the environmental impact when we increase the size larger than 900, because the hole gets bigger, the shoreline gets smaller, and there's more impact. So
no, I jumped back to definition, but I see where you're going, yes.
I think it might be more useful to talk about the frontage that a boathouse has than the square footage of a boathouse, if we're really concerned about the shore front.
Well, that brings up another interesting point. When people come in for shorefront permits, they're looking at the reference line, which is a straight line shore frontage, and most people know that a shoreline is not a straight line. So are people to be using the straight line frontage for determining if they have the 150 feet of frontage on Winnipesaukee for a boathouse, or is it the actual lake frontage? Because there's another discrepancy between how the town looks at it and the state looks at it.
And
So
I
how do
think
you
the state
determine it?
uses an average,
Correct.
yeah.
how do you determine it?
They come in and they tell me that their frontage is X, and then if they qualify, they come before you for a boathouse.
So it's by a licensed person with a
Correct.
stamp.
What I'm saying is there's a minor discrepancy in the regulations that we have. When you're determining your reference line for the purpose of your 50, 150, and 250, that is a straight line. That is not an actual undulating shoreline. So if you want to be clear on that, that should be clarified.
Well, under 175-63, shore frontage is measured in 50-foot straight line increments.
Correct, but the reference line is not.
Okay, anything else?
So I actually had an engineer speak to me on the phone today, and I didn't have an answer, and I said that I would ask the planning board. If you have an undulating shoreline that moves arguably in 50-foot straight line increments, does the reference line follow that, or is it a straight line? What people are doing, frankly, is they're trying to cheat closer to the water.
Rich, do you have an extra copy that you could give our secretary? I'm sorry. Okay, go ahead, folks, sorry.
So it doesn't come up often, just something to think about if you're going to make a change to the shorefront.
So if I was to send a message from the planning board as a representative, I would say use the most restrictive measure that you could use.
Correct.
But what that can do is drive the boathouse back into the land, which means
Correct.
there's more excavation.
We were just told they're trying to cheat, so if they're trying to cheat, which
Well,
way are they going to cheat?
If
Well,
they're,
I think
if
it
they're
depends on
building a
whether-
house, they're trying to cheat. If they're building a boathouse, it works to their advantage.
Right, it depends on which structure you're looking at, the house or the boathouse.
That's why I asked him which way they're trying to cheat, because I want him to understand what we as a town look at preserving, and if they're trying to cheat, which way are they cheating?
Well, and which way they're cheating depends on what structure they're trying to get a permit for.
I think we should eliminate the idea of cheating and just make our regulations really clear.
Yes, that would be the most appropriate, yes.
Interesting approach.
Well, I guess the other question I'd have is that how much are you going to be cheating by? Is it like 1% or 5%?
I think that's going to
It may
depend on
be
the contour of the
irrelevant.
shoreline.
It all depends.
Well, I'm sure it depends, but, you know.
I mean, the one I went through today, if you look at the tax card, it says there's 120 feet of shoreland frontage. Now, for the record, I understand tax maps are just a guide, it's not an actual survey, all of the asterisks are underneath that. But when you measure in 50-foot increments, you go from 120 to 148. Because it pops in a little bit here and it pops in a little bit more here. And if you look at the tax card, the line jogs. And if you measure point for point, in this particular case, to John's question, they were still 2 feet shy of being able to pursue a boathouse.
Well, and
But
also,
because the lines are only accurate within 6 feet, they also decided to hire a surveyor to find out how much frontage do I have. For them, it was worth the thousands it is to get a survey done to find out if they could have a boathouse.
and
They should be having a survey anyway if they're doing,
and what corner of the lot do
improvements
we
to their
start
property.
in? Can they choose?
Correct.
Yeah. Because it's different if you
Well,
start on one end.
we'll get to the survey
other.
anyway point in a minute, but
Yeah.
just something to think about.
Well,
Okay.
if we're really considering how you measure shore frontage in 175-64A2, side yard straight line shore frontage, which seems to me should be measured in 50-foot increments to be consistent.
Would you cite that?
175-64A2, page.
And there was a petition on article a couple of years ago about changing that. Is it actually relevant to increase the side yard setback because of the amount of shore frontage? Question mark. I know it's always been written that way, but I mean, that's why people review things.
Okay, can we move ahead? Special exception uses, 175-66, and then 175-67, shorefront lot improvement standards. This is where there are some changes. So the first one, A1, is the addition of the 225 square feet or more of impervious surface. That was the one that we discussed at the last time we talked about this issue.
For reference,
And this was
200
Rich's.
square feet is the trigger for a freestanding building permit, not 225. I don't know where 225 came from, but
No,
200 would be at least consistent with a shed that somebody may want. A shed under 200 square feet doesn't require a permit.
okay, so everybody want to change this to,
Does anybody know where 225 came from?
It was,
I
I
think
believe,
Rich, it came out of Rich's mind.
which equates to a 15 by 15 area,
Oh.
for what that's worth.
Okay, well, following on that, does every 15 by 15 square foot area actually warrant an engineer?
I'm not suggesting it does, I just think that's where it came from.
And that was my next question. Is this for new projects or an existing property that's just somebody wants to move a shed in on Reed's Ferry?
All.
The last 5 shorefront permits I've looked at have all been in the neighborhood of 225 square feet. And they are definitely projects that would not have happened if an engineer was required. I'm not saying that should be the threshold, but somebody says, I want to make my front porch 5 feet larger or 15 square feet longer, or whatever it is. There's a pretty good price tag that comes with using the word engineer.
Well, this is a change we made back on the 18th because the earlier version had a professional
Yeah, for all of them,
engineer.
yes.
The only thing I would suggest is that we decide who the appropriate professional is. Or who, a class of who is appropriate, just so
So
you
further.
can't bring in your lawn care specialist.
Furthering the discussion on the 18th and having thought about it, my question for the board is it more relevant if somebody is north of 20% or north of 25%, where someone is getting close to the limit? Perhaps. Because taking someone's word on it, yep, I'm at 29.8. Boy, isn't that uncanny? But it's a lot of expense for someone that might be fighting the battle between 6 and 8%. The big projects, it's unfortunate because there's no way to say, look, if you're tearing down a 1950s cottage and putting in a 6,500 square foot house, clearly you need an engineer. They pay for it without thinking about it. Because they don't want to deal with the paperwork. They just hire someone to deal with that problem. I'm trying to think of the average person that, has an older home and they want to make the house a little bit bigger or put a shed in the backyard, dropping a $5,000 to $10,000 engineer bill on their lap for a shed that they're paying less than that for. Just something to think about. And I'm not trying to devalue water quality. I'm not trying to devalue any of those things, but there seems as though something proportional
What do the
needs to be
planning
thought
board
about.
members think about the number 1? No, for projects adding 225 square feet or more of impervious surface.
I honestly like to hear from a designer or some of the people that come as applicants, agents. So again, if we make the stuff so small, then these guys are going to be bombed. They're not going to want to have to deal with this stuff. It's just, I think there's a balance between professionalism and asking the professionals out there to be able to look at the big jobs or the jobs that they can at least look at. I mean, when it comes down to it, the little guys are just going to get pushed off. They probably won't get it because the other guys are so busy. I'm having a tough time with it. I see your point, and I understand it. Should we increase the square footage amount to make it more practical, or is this... I don't know what the conditions are or what the things are that we're trying to catch.
Well, I would suggest that we're trying to make sure that we don't have too much impervious surface on a lot, and I agree with you that perhaps the trip point should be more than even 225 square feet so that it doesn't make an undue burden on somebody that just wants to put up a shed.
And we should also decide who an appropriate professional is, because I think the goal was so that you didn't have to hire a professional engineer or a surveyor for that matter.
I mean, doesn't this 225 take in something like, we just want to put a patio out back underneath the barbecue?
Oh, that's landscaping, but...
That's impervious service. Isn't that the same?
Maybe it's a
Or-
% increase in impervious that triggers it. I know there was discussion about not requiring a surveyor and engineer, but quite frankly, when you get down to something that is square footage out of square footage, that is up to a surveyor to let you know.
Roger, can you suggest what type of professional other than an engineer might be appropriate for determining the impervious or pervious surface?
That's not really my area of expertise. I mean, I think obviously an engineer or a surveyor, but I'm not sure who you would get.
Nor am I, which is why I'm asking the question. It's a good question. I
agree it's a good question.
Yeah.
So the only other people other than surveyors or engineers that turn them in regularly here are wetland scientists. And I don't know if without attempting to offend all the wetland scientists, I don't know if they are of equal par when it comes down to surveyors and engineers.
Well, I think from Jim's testimony last week, the wetland scientist goes out and he flags the wetland area for him to go out and create the
Correct.
outline and find the criteria that will fit in that outline. So we want the licensed guy to make that determination, because we can't say, okay, it's a big project, we want your legal determination, we want this guy, and when it's a small project, we only need this guy.
Okay, so you're saying a professional engineer or surveyor, right?
Somebody that, again, we're consistent, we want the stamp.
Right.
You should add a surveyor.
Yeah, I'm just struggling to think of who other than an engineer or surveyor could provide the information that we need.
Well, if you're putting in a 15 by 15 foot patio or shed, you're going to know that you're adding 225 square feet of impervious surface, aren't you?
Certainly you know how much you're adding, but I think the problem is understanding how much impervious surface already exists on the lot.
And I'll say the run-of-the-mill permit that comes in includes sidewalks, the pathway to the greenhouse, the top surface area of a retaining wall or a stone wall. People are not overlooking impervious. They're not trying to ignore impervious to get through the permit process. And this is whether it's, Norway Plains or Horizons or Joe Public. Believe it or not, most people actually try and comply with the regulations.
Pull it closer.
See, I think a licensed land surveyor would be plenty capable enough to working on determining how much impervious is on the property and in the added, do the percentages there. Where you're going to need the professional engineer is when it triggers and you have to design a stormwater management system, then you're talking about getting the professional engineer in to stamp the design for that property. So I think there's two different things there that we're looking at, so.
So I think there's an architect. I know that there's an architect in Meredith, Chris Williams Architect, and they design, and that's where I saw a set of plans, and they had outlined all their impervious areas, so an architect designing also could be one.
Right.
Okay, professional surveyor, engineer, or architect? Okay,
Well, so an architect would know how big the shed is, but an architect won't know what percentage of lot coverage is without a surveyor.
I think they'd go out and hire a surveyor, is what they would
Right.
do.
yeah, right,
Right.
right.
So that brings you back to the question, 225 square feet, 5% increase, any percent increase over 20%, 500 square feet.
All right, those are all options. We have to decide what we want to do. Yeah.
And I'm trying to think, I cannot think of a shoreland permit since I've been here that is beyond 30% on a site that wasn't 30% or greater before they started. the average project coming to Wolfeboro is going from 8 to 12 or 12 to 16, something in that neighborhood. But it's very hard. I mean, you don't have an easy challenge on coming up with this number because you have half-acre lots and 5-acre lots. The difference in that coverage is immense.
Okay, so what size do we want?
I would think that we should relate it to shore frontage, not lot size, if we're concerned about the water. I think that's where this is all coming from.
So treat it like the side setback?
The
Up to
criteria
up to
based on the
75
amount
feet.
of lake that you're impacting.
I think we should
It's a
do what
whole-
we've done in the past and send out a couple questions to Randy Tatro's Horizons and ask them what they think about the number.
Can do that too?
Okay,
We've done that in the past.
yep, that's true.
And we don't have to decide tonight.
That's right. We do not.
We can put this as an open question and come back to it after we've had some time to think about it.
Okay, so
The
we need
200,
to send a letter to the surveyors and engineers and get their feedback.
If the board's okay with it, I can send it to all the frequent flyers in Wolfeboro.
That's
the
a pretty good idea, because some
225
of them are
square
around
foot.
the edges, and they actually see other places. They don't work just here. They know it was customary in other towns.
Oh, definitely.
I don't know, so who are you sending it to?
People that turn things in for shorefront permits would be Norway Plains, it would be Horizons, it would be Jones and Beach, it would be Peter Cooper Dock.
And they'll have experience from other towns as well.
Oh, yeah, believe it or not, everybody works everywhere, but town employees.
Peter Kupadoc, he's a wetland
Correct.
person.
Yeah, Tavis, I'd appreciate it if you would do that.
Okay, all right, and Tavis, when you're back to impervious surface, you said the houses, roofs, decks, patios, paved gravel or crushed stone driveways, parking areas, walkways, and you said stone walls?
Retaining walls, stone walls.
Okay, because the definition doesn't include that.
No, that's why I'm sharing it. That's that's the level of detail coming in with applications. If it's technically impervious, they typically include it,
Okay, well,
which I think would be better for the
what I just
lake.
read to you is from the RSA 483:4:B11B, impervious surface. That's where I came up with that, because I was curious about what we were including. I read the definition in our regulations, and I also checked the state, and they're pretty much the same. It doesn't say anything about retaining walls or stone walls. So,
But if that's best practices for the surveyors, then I'd rather take what they're using, because it's probably a little bit more strict if they're doing it in many, many, many towns. They're going to have their own checklist of everything.
okay, well, then that's
better-
probably we should ask
More than
them
less.
how they determine impervious surface.
The 225 square foot limit ends up being a different percentage for different size lots. Would it be more useful to have a certain percentage increase rather than square footage?
That would be my suggestion, yes.
I mean, it means that, we would like to have it in that general range, but if you are a bigger lot, you're still not increasing it by a certain, it really limits the larger lots to a very small amount.
Correct. And when I suggested that, the other one was to require an engineer if you're north of 20%. Because I mean, realistically, there's no real science behind the 30% coverage maximum or the amount of infiltration that you put in based on 15 to 20 or 20 to 30. There's no way to quantify the benefit to the lake, if you will, other than being consistent.
So I would say that we should change the 225 to a certain percentage, and I don't know what that percentage would be, but
That'll be part of, that's how I'm framing the question in my mind to go out to the third party. Is this better asked as a square footage or a percentage of the site?
A percentage of shoreline.
Percentage of shoreline, yes.
Okay, let's see, so we're done talking about one, right? And now we go to 175-67A, 1A.
I worry about the percentage of shoreline, which is a linear measurement, and we're talking about an area rather than a line. So I don't know whether the shoreline is necessarily the way we should do it, because how do you equate a line to an area?
Ergo the question. If you have 30% of this area discharging to 100 feet, is that different than discharging to 300 feet? I mean, the way most of this is set up, there should be no discharge because it's all supposed to be infiltrated. Within the parameters of A, B, and C.
Okay, how about 1A? For
So-
development on a lot where impervious coverage is or will not increase to 15%.
So we're going to look into changing the square footage to percentage?
This is what it currently says in A.
The wording 1A says no greater than 30% of the
Yeah.
area. The what's in the existing text.
Well, right, but the existing text has some crossover numbers, so the draft that was handed out tonight clarifies it. It says if you're between 15 to 20, which is what was voted on a couple of years ago, you have to have at least one element.
Right.
What it doesn't say is one element adequate to control the runoff or adequate to control the stormwater from greater than 15%.
No. 1A in the text says no greater than 30% of the area of a lot within the protected shoreline may be composed of impervious surface. In the new text, it says will increase to 15%.
No, it seems to be the same, John.
Are
Well,
you
yes,
on
it's
175?
renumbered. The 30% reference is on D.
Yes, and the new regulation referred to D, which is the same as A in the old.
So 0 to 15, you do this, or, I'm sorry, 0 to,
Yeah.
well, 0 to 14, you do nothing. 15 to 20, you do one thing. 21 to 30,
Those
you
are the
do
ones
something
that
else,
he's
but you can't
proposing
have more than
changing.
30.
It's just being moved.
It's really not this hard.
No, John, just go to, in the one in your right hand, go to D.
Same wording as there.
So you're saying it says the same thing as A that's in the text?
No, I'm not saying it says the same thing as A. I'm just saying it refers to the same control. They're trying to have that 30% limitation. It's not worded the same.
Yeah,
addressing the
existing
same
text
point.
A is now D.
I think this is where Vaughn's idea comes into play there when we can see, because A, B, and D are all intertwined.
Yes, and in the July 18th version, which, as Vaughn pointed out, has the green and red text, A1A addresses from 15 to 20%, whereas the new one that we got this evening just says 15% or more.
Right.
Yeah, I didn't get the colored text. I just got all black, so.
Oh, no, the color text one I have is what I saved from July.
July 18th, you're right. Mine isn't colored either, John.
I'm just suggesting that in the one that Rich provided to us this evening, that perhaps A1A, instead of saying impervious cover is or will increase to 15% or more, it should say will increase to from 15% up to 20%, and then B should be 21% or more, well,
Yeah,
or
right.
more than 20%, I guess.
Yeah.
Because a strict reading here, if you have something where it's going to increase to 22%, for example, then you would have to comply with both A and B. And I think the intent is that it would have to be A or B, not A and B.
Okay, so by just adding 15 to 20%, that's what you're proposing, right?
That change makes it easier to read for the applicant.
Yes, that's right.
What it says now.
We just want to be clear that the requirement to comply with A1A stops if you're over 20% because you'd be impacted by B instead.
Okay,
So that should read exceed 20% for B.
That would be easier, yes, greater than 20% in B.
Yes.
Well, what would be easier if it was in a block where you could say, okay, you're in this block at 15%, these are the things that you have to do, because A is basically saying, if you meet 15%, you have to put rain gardens and infiltration trenches. B says basically if you go increase cover over 21%, you need a professional engineer. So, I mean, you could have it laid out in a block form where if you get to the first block, you know you got to do all the other things that are past that.
Right, so in practice, what happens if someone ends up at 16% right now, they put in a rain garden. If they end up at 22%, they have an engineered plan that shows they're picking up the delta from pre-project to post-project in the system that they're putting in. I don't know if that's what the board wants to keep or not.
I would suggest that for A1A, it could be worded that for development on a lot where impervious cover is or will increase above 15% up to 20%, at least one stormwater control measure, and then for B, where impervious cover exceeds 20%.
That's what it says now.
And that would segregate the
Will
two
exceed,
classes.
Yeah, will exceed 20%.
That's what current,
That's
uh,
pretty
A
much what it currently says.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And keep the rest of it, right?
I think so.
Yep.
Well, in the second paragraph of B, I think there needs to be the reference to the other section of the ordinance that talks about where you can't replant.
I'm sorry, repeat that, please.
17567A1B, second paragraph, talks about replanting within the 25-point grid system. There are exceptions to the replanting within the current regulations. My point was it should simply be referenced unless accepted herein, or point to the section that talks about the exceptions from the replanting. Because there are a number of places with large perch beaches or ledge or cliff, for lack of a better phrase, that cannot physically be planted, that are already exempt from the replanting. This says, thou shalt plant, but you have to know that the exemption is somewhere else. My point is just mention the exemption section in that paragraph.
Okay, that makes sense.
Where is that?
17567A1B, second paragraph.
No, I know
Where's the
that. Where's your
reference?
exception?
Vaughn wrote it, I've got to find it.
I think it's C5 175-67C5, I believe is what you're looking for.
Yep.
Yes.
And that's in here, and it seems to be in the right place.
Yes, it is.
I mean, it's obvious enough when you see it. It's just also in the regulations.
I have a question about the fact that
Okay, well, can we
these,
finish this thought in just a second, Peter? What do we want to do about this? Do you want to make some changes or not?
I think Tavis's suggestion was in that second paragraph of 175-67A1B to make reference to C5.
Okay,
Correct.
C5.
okay, go ahead, Peter.
I have a question about the fact that the code enforcement officer is supposed to be checking these things every 5 years, and I guess my question is if there is enough bandwidth to do that.
I can give you a partial answer to that question. All this says is they do a report and they turn it in. Yep, sucked it out. Here's your report. What are we achieving?
At the same time, the code enforcement officer could go and visit to see whether the report was true. But my question is there enough bandwidth to enforce these things which we are saying should be done?
I guess the bigger question is what if they're not? I mean, it's easy enough to say this project received a CO on July 5th of 2023. Let's go in Outlook and put something in July 5th, 2028 and see if we got this report. What if they don't? Are we going to make them tear down the house they built and rip it up? Or are we going to make sure they go forward and do the maintenance? Typically, the maintenance section on these reports or on the plans is fairly straight. I mean, it's written on the plans. My concern is that most homeowners aren't going to have any idea what the stormwater person put as a condition for maintenance, much less 2 owners later figure out if, when was the last report submitted and what are we doing. I understand the idea behind this, but I don't know what we're checking.
But the practicality is that we may be saying this, and if it's not enforced, then why do we even put it in the regulation?
Well, where it would be very easy to enforce is if there happened to be a complaint that, hey, we just had a 3-inch rain event and it looked like everything went over the Goodwin's property. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Goodwin, it appears that rain is flowing freely across your property. Do you recall that in 2017 you did a stormwater or a shorefront permit with maintenance? Our records indicate no maintenance reports. And that would be the recourse to say, no, technically you're in violation of the building permit. But I think the bandwidth to do it, yes. But by that, all this requires someone to do is turn in a report. The code official nor I have no ability to know whether someone did or did not vacuum their pavers. You can't tell by looking at them.
So here's a scenario. Somebody has a crushed stone area. A couple of years down the line, we want to pave it. Guy comes in, paves it. It's now impervious.
Well, it's impervious when it was crushed gravel. Now it's impervious, and there's no permit required to do that. So the town isn't even going to know that somebody paved over 15 years ago stormwater infiltration system.
Here's another instance. Somebody comes in front of us, they do a wetland crossing, we ask them to do a buffer. We have the agent that stands in front of us, says, this is what we'll do. Go by the place, year later, they just happen to pave another area right next to the brook where the buffer area is.
That's more easily tracked than Peter's question.
I mean, so these things are going to happen out there, and we're not going to know about it. until somebody complains.
Well, and that's why I try to say, if somebody complains, hey, everything's flowing across Thurston's property, the town needs to look. Dear Mr. Thurston, we've been contacted, this water's going, we don't have a recent report from you. As you may recall, 175-67.
But how would that third property owner of that piece of property even know?
They won't.
So therefore, they're not going to be making a report.
I think it's worse than that. I would think even the first owner probably doesn't know. Because the mechanics of Wolfeboro being what they are, it's very rarely Roger Murray coming in and doing a project. And I just picked Roger because I saw him first when I said it. It's the folks that move in, sight unseen, buy a gangbuster price for $2.2 million on the lake and hire someone to put in the house they want. Someone who does all the engineering work to get that permitting in place does all of that. The owner doesn't care. So the next step of this is how do we make sure that somebody that signs on a shorefront permit actually has some legal hook to compel the owner that they're designing this for to do it? Do we need to record something against the property? Do we want to go that far?
If it's on the plan, the owner's charged with knowledge of it, whether he knows it or not. And if you require maintenance reports every 5 years and you don't get one, you can send the guy a nice letter saying, by the way, we didn't receive and under the terms of your approval.
Right.
If you have any questions, please contact us.
So to Peter's point, yes, do we have the bandwidth? Yep, got a report, throw it in the file. I don't know what we're gaining with that.
Well, if you don't maintain these things, they don't work.
Oh, no, I get that. I'm going further to say just because somebody said they hired, Joe Suckham to come fix their porous pavement doesn't mean it was done correctly.
No, the only time it really does get checked is when you want to make a change. Your new
Correct.
owner wants to change, he has to come in and comply, and then all the old records are available.
So E says that we could have the town's code enforcement officer inspect it. So if we did that, would we charge a fee? And should we, when somebody comes to you and said, oh, I'm here to have my codes officer come check my stuff, what would we do? We would have a protocol, a sheet. He would, but there would be a fee. He would have to, we're either going to be doing it for free or they're going to pay another licensed engineer, and when the costs come up for the licensed engineer, they're probably going to say, oh, I'd rather have it done for free.
All this says is they have to turn in a maintenance report every 5 years. Doesn't say it's done by somebody licensed, certified, qualified, or otherwise. And then, for some reason, should we happen to notice that somebody hasn't turned one in, the code officer can address it. I get the point. I do. I get the point of this paragraph entirely. I don't know if it's... I think it was a soft way to start encouraging people to be responsible for their property.
No, I know, but if we want a real program, we need to create a real program. We just can't be like making suggestions here and this is what's going to happen. We have to step forward and say this is what's happening.
Okay, so how would you change that, John?
Well, again,
We're on E.
yeah, we're on E.
I mean, to John's point, no, the code officer is not
I was
qualified.
asking him,
Maybe what we should say is I don't want to put the pressure on the planner, but the planner has to create a program system or something where somebody can come in and get the codes officer to go out there. I don't know exactly what needs to be worded in here. I'm
Yeah.
just,
Well, John, I think one of the concerns that Tavis mentioned earlier is that how do we enforce that? Certainly, we can't expect the homeowners to take the initiative to come in and bring the planner out. I don't think they're going to be thinking about that 5 years from now. And even if it's in the planner's calendar to go out and look at it, does the planner have the authority to go on somebody's property to inspect it?
oh, we have to put that in there and say the town has the authority to come inspect it 5 years later.
That's not quite what I was suggesting. What this is telling me is that everyone that gets a shorefront permit with one of these systems, they are going to turn in a report every 5 years. To answer Peter's question, yes, there's absolutely bandwidth and an easy system to set up a reminder that X number of reports are due on a particular date, and it's very easy to generate a letter when it comes in. What I nor the building inspector are qualified to do is do that inspection that you're talking about and determine if it was done correctly, et cetera. So all this is really saying is, oh, you didn't turn in a report, you're going to get a letter. And we can come up with a process that follows after that. But what this is suggesting to me is that this is a condition of the approval.
Right.
So where it's a condition of the approval, I don't think 5 years later we really have the reach with this paragraph to make somebody remove their addition or peel up their driveway or do something like that. All they have to do is create a maintenance report. So to that end, that's a bunch of legwork for somebody to turn in a form that said, yep, I did it, sorry, it's late. I'm not trying to belittle it at all, because this actually has a lot of teeth to it. I just don't think it's got enough the way it's written.
Most things in our ordinance in our town are regulated by reports of noncompliance by others.
Correct.
So it's the neighbors, just don't make your neighbors angry.
Well, and I mean, it would be wonderful if every time a property in the shorefront changed hands, hey, don't forget, annual maintenance reports.
So how would you integrate Peter's idea into this?
Peter's idea?
Yeah, Peter's idea of the computer spitting out the information that says,
I don't know the functional difference between having them turn in a maintenance report that is perhaps worth the paper it's written on. And I'm not questioning the professionals, but why not simply just have it something that every 5 years in quotes, I know it says 5 years in text here, but a letter go out to all those that have received a shorefront permit under these qualifications and say, have you verified your system?
It's like your dog license.
Yeah. But at least with the dog license, there's a whole statute behind it and a giant penalty.
Okay, so we should add a letter should be sent?
Well, I don't think adding a letter should be sent needs to be in the code. I think that should be part of the planning department's operation, but I don't think it needs to be written in the ordinance.
Oh, okay, well, at least it would get
And
done.
I'm happy to start with a paragraph like this and talk to the town attorney and find out what leverage could actually be exerted out after 5 years.
I would encourage that, and maybe we should move on until we know the answer to that.
I definitely think that we should develop a program so that in the future it can be addressed, whether or not Tavis is here, Bob's here, Joe's here, or whoever's here. I mean, it has to be a program that's established that pops up in our office and says, these things need to be looked at.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
that's what this is suggesting.
Yeah, but
And then Tavis is saying, and send a letter, and failure to provide such a report will be addressed by the town's code enforcement officer. So there is a mechanism there.
No, I want to make sure, Kathy, that that paragraph has enough mustard behind it to make somebody replace it. If it's been 5 years and they don't have any proof of any maintenance, presume it has failed and have them either prove it hasn't failed or replace it. Because otherwise, we just have dead systems out there.
Well, yeah, and you could end up just saying, I'd really like to plant a garden in that rain garden, and I put a whole lot of fill in, and all of a sudden, it's not a rain garden anymore.
Right.
But if it's in the a condition of approval, then it seems like we can do it without legal advice. I mean, we're just reminding somebody of a condition of an approval. And that would be part of the permit when you issue the shorefront permit. Okay, can we just go back here to C? All newly generated stormwater shall be managed on the development site. Anybody have any issues with that? Okay. D, no development shall increase impervious lot coverage above 30%. For development on a lot with existing impervious coverage over 30%, no increase in impervious coverage is permitted.
I don't know if the second sentence is required.
Number D, is that what you're saying?
Yes. I agree with Tavis. I think the second sentence is not necessary.
I actually look at it a little differently. I think that should be back in number A, right in the front, that says no lot should be developed over 30%, basically.
So, yeah, so we can consider reordering the paragraphs.
Yes, I know.
I don't have an issue with reordering the paragraphs, but the question at the moment is the content of the paragraph.
I would keep it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, right. I thought that was good.
I mean, it basically gives you your parameters right off the bat.
Right.
All right, the question, though, is that second sentence necessary?
I believe it is, because if I have a lot with over 30%, I can say, hey, no problem. I'm already over 30%, so I can just keep going.
Well, perhaps we should rephrase it then that the whole paragraph to say no development is permitted on lots with impervious coverage at 30% or more.
Which is all subject to a variance anyway, so I don't know what you gain with,
Right.
because they're both desktop calls. If somebody wants to read it and say, well, I'm at 38, so I can go to 48, okay, well, no.
So-
You're going to be told, no, you're north of 30, you're done, regardless of two sentences or not.
So the existing text for A, no greater than 30% of the area of a lot within the protected shoreline may be composed of impervious surfaces. So, again, this second sentence is an add-on from Rich that, again, depends which one you like. Do you like the one that the text that's there already, or the new text?
Well, the new
For people
text-
that read it every day, it says exactly the same thing.
I would leave the existing text in A in the location that it is. This is it right here.
Yeah, no, I know. I'm looking at it. Okay. Any other feelings on that?
No, I would agree with John's statement about leaving it
Okay.
as the first thing and with that, the previous
Okay,
wording.
with the existing wording.
That's right.
Yeah, right. Move to A. Okay.
Strike
Yeah. No, I know. Right. It says move.
So
move to
one
A.
of the paragraphs that's missing here, that's in the current regulations, if you're over 30 and you decrease by 1%, you don't have to do the infiltration. I'm not making a position statement one way or the other, but I want the board to recognize that this draft already makes that assumption. So currently, if you're at 32% and you propose a project that ends at 31%, you don't have to comply with this document's A, B, or C, because you're reducing. And that is coming out with this draft. Just something, I just want you to remember that that's happening. In practical terms, if you have an existing quote-unquote non-conforming lot that's got 33% impervious, and you renovate and you have 32%, I think it was left in as a benefit because you are reducing, but because you have the right to maintain the 33% you've always had, you don't have to put in the infiltration systems. I understand the lake benefits by having infiltration for everything north of 15%. I'm not denying that. But as long as you as the board, when you make this recommendation, acknowledge that paragraph is coming out, I think you need to acknowledge that.
So the problem with that could be you won't be putting in infiltration trenches because your yard's already developed. And you might get a rain garden somewhere, but what level of a rain garden is it? It's not the deep trench with 2 feet of crushed stone and the depths and...
By this draft, you would have to pick up everything north of 20%. Which is a vast difference from somebody who's at 33% or 38% without anything.
Which would essentially make you tear the whole yard up.
Depending on how it's arranged, yeah.
When you normally wouldn't have to tear the yard up, which then you'd expose soil and runoff at that point, which is already compacted and held to the ground.
So the instances where I've seen this come up, somebody already has a large existing home with a patio and they want to tear down a shed because they're doing construction within, even though it's demolition, they're technically doing construction within the shorefront. They turn in a shorefront permit. They remove the additional impervious surface. I think the last one I saw went from 33 to 32.5%. It was just a small outbuilding. But when they're tearing down the small outbuilding, we want to make sure they do the silt fence and the silt sock so the building doesn't end up going in the water, et cetera. Current regulation doesn't require them to pick up all the infiltration. I understand the direction of this is to pick up all the infiltration ever when possible. But something for the board to think about is if you have 33% and you go to 32%, should the expectation be there to put in the infiltration? So it's a big change from what's written.
And perhaps an undue burden. If somebody's trying to improve infiltration by removing the impervious surface, you don't want to put an additional burden on them of having to put in whatever stormwater mitigation might be required.
For everything north of 20%?
Yes.
Yeah, that's pretty
Yes.
Which is huge.
substantial.
Yeah.
Just something to think about.
Okay, we've gotten to E. How about F? All proposed storm management system must be verified.
I thought, I mean, I don't want to move on. I think we either need to, we just can't let this die, that conversation that Tavis just gave us. I mean, this is a real situation here. We either need to make a decision on getting that back in because we've talked about it and it should stay in, or it should go out.
I'm leaning towards keeping it in.
I'm leaning towards in.
My suggestion, because there's two people suggested about keeping it in, I would like to include that in the email questions to the engineers. What are the implications of this?
Yes, I'd be happy to have other opinions.
One of the comments that came up with some of last year's proposals, there was an engineer, and I'll leave the firm out of it because it's irrelevant, but the engineer said, what are you guys trying to stop here? Short of putting an earthen dam along the reference line, we don't have the ability to control the dissolved phosphorus and the nitrogen and all the stuff that's coming out of stormwater. He said, okay, I gave it away, it's a he. He also said, the biggest problem they have in dealing with the town shorefront regulations is all the unfettered flow coming off the roadways. He said that is a heck of a burden to put on a private property owner who's trying not only to contend with their own runoff, but that which they're receiving from off-site, whether it's a town road or private road, et cetera. So to try and contain all of that is, he said, short of an earthen dam around the lake, you're not going to achieve where you're trying to go. But I want to have that balance by people that were higher up that design path and say, what does this do? You know, I might see 50 or 60 shorefront permits a year. They see hundreds. So I think their perspective on 33% becoming 32%, how much of that can you actually capture what is the water quality benefit of that? Now, I get it. On the broad scale, if we took all of the shorefront property and we're able to capture everything north of 20%, we're going to have a heck of an impact on water quality. I get that. But at what, where is the threshold for the incremental projects over time from the design perspective?
So would you leave the 1% or would you change the 1% to a larger number?
My recommendation last year was that it has to go from 1%.
Okay.
It has to go, it should be substantive. 1% change on a small lot is huge, on a big lot is nominal. Do we draw the line at 225 square feet or do we draw it at 500 square feet? Well, how big the lot is the next question. So I think, as was suggested earlier, it's not the square foot of the project, it's a percent coverage. So if your existing is greater than 30 and you're doing something that represents a X% decrease, you don't have to do the infiltration. But I don't know where that number is without talking to the people that design these things.
So, and the ghost in the room here is, it's not just a shed that might be being removed. The whole house may come down, and a new house, which is 1% or more smaller, goes in.
And
That is a
And that's a
different
much
story.
different equation than the garage coming
Yeah.
down, correct?
Yeah.
So I think,
It should have something to do with new construction versus just removing something that was there.
yeah, there are many places, well, many. I would say I have seen at least 10 where there was an existing site. It was primarily large circular driveway, wasn't paved, nominal cabin, couple of outbuildings, but when you break it down, it's 33%. It turns into a reasonably prudent paved driveway going down to a mansion at 33%. Aha, we've complied. That, I think, is that was the driver behind that paragraph coming out. You didn't do anything, you abused the system. So I think there has to be a nuance to when that comes in. That makes sense?
I think something about new
So
construction.
Vaughn, are you suggesting a threshold to say something if you exceed 1,000 square feet of new construction? Or, no, Roger's shaking his head. I'm just trying to understand what you're,
I think it would be more along the lines of, in the case of 100% residential structure replacement, you start over as though you had no lot coverage to begin with.
Right,
Okay, well, John was asking Vaughn for her thoughts,
right.
right?
yeah. Vaughn?
Vaughn?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand what you said.
I asked you what you thought the threshold was, or how would you address it?
Well, I think new construction is a whole different issue than removing something from old construction. And if it's new construction, it probably should comply with the new rules. I don't know how you say that.
Well, exactly, and that was Peter's point. He didn't say it into the microphone, but he's right. If you use the wording I used with the 100% replacement, he said they'll leave the chimney. Yes, that will happen, but that's a desktop call. I don't think we're going to say, well, you left the doghouse on the property, so technically there's still some, existing structure. That's really not what's happening here.
It could be a threshold determining whether it's a minor project or if it turns into a major project. You could put a dollar value on that, or a square footage, or however you want to determine it. But a lot of permits are based on, when we do renovations in commercial construction, if you're doing over a certain amount of renovation, then it kicks you into following full code compliance. So maybe there's a threshold that you could set.
Well, it's similar to that as the existing building code. If you disturb more than 50% of the existing building, you no longer get to comply with the existing building code. You have to comply with the new code.
So maybe align it with that.
So something in that parameter would work.
And I think it would be wise to keep it consistent with other building code that people are familiar with, and not invent something new.
Stepping over that line,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. We can work on that. If there's interest in acknowledging those that are greater than 30% having a different qualification than paragraphs A through C, we can look at where those thresholds would be and see if the board is comfortable with those.
Okay, any other thoughts? All right, the F is all proposed storm management systems must be verified by an inspection by the code officer or on-site inspection by a licensed engineer. Any thoughts there?
That is what the board's recommendation was last year.
Well,
Okay.
our existing, all proposed stormwater management systems must be verified via photographic documentation, so is that not still viable?
How do I know which hole you took a photo of?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
How do I know which hole you took a photo of?
Yours or the guy down the street?
So most of these infiltration systems, I know you install them, but they'll have different layers of X, Y, and Z. So what's written on, when those are proposed, the condition I put on the permit is that either the inspector or an engineer supervise that layering so that we're sure that it at least went in the ground the way it was designed. So if you have I mean, it's the same slippery slope you do if you do photographic inspections of a house. Yep, here's my insulation inspection. See all the insulation? What house am I looking at? So I say, which hole am I looking at? Which hole with gravel in it am I looking at?
Well,
So my suggestion was to get away from photography and say, well, you have them showing up for every other inspection, make sure that your stormwater gets inspected.
Don't we, I mean, when we issue a certificate of compliance, don't we do this anyway?
You will never see, you'll see pavers, but you're not going to know if they've got the 15 layers of gravel and felt below it.
well, I mean,
That's something that's done before the house goes vertical, typically.
so when somebody digs an infiltration trench, they're putting in the stone, inch and a half stone on the bottom, the filter fabric's going up the sides. When do you want to come and look at it?
When they put it in, before they cover it up, it's just like every other inspection. When do you inspect electrical? Before you cover it. When do you inspect insulation? Before you cover it.
So from a code enforcement perspective, are you happy with,
This is happening already, yes.
but are you happy with the way this is worded now, Tanner?
Yes, this was the suggestion that was made
Okay.
for last year's change, yes.
So here's the way it's worded now, or the one in Rich's thing? The on-site inspection by
No, the one that Richard handed out with the
Yeah,
on-site inspection.
Okay, that's the one you're talking about, Doug?
Yes, that's right, the one
Okay.
that we received this evening.
Yeah,
Rather
okay.
than the photographic one.
Right, yeah. I mean, that certainly makes sense to me.
But to that end, most often it is an engineer that's doing it. Because most of the projects that trigger the on-site stormwater have more than stormwater engineered. The engineer's already there, they witnessed it, they sign off on it.
Okay,
Well, I'd just like to go back to the documentation of this, of the, rain gardens and things like that. If the report was to include photographic evidence, that may end up being useful to anybody looking at it. In other words, instead of just saying, yeah, I did it, if the report ended up having photographic evidence of that system, that would end up solving many of the
Yes.
problems.
So if you're in, I'll just use MS4 because it's the one that really drilled down on this. What equipment was used? What was the volume and tonnage removed?
Right.
Where was it disposed of? All those, I mean, if that were built into paragraph E, sure, let's go for it.
Yeah.
But I don't, I think if we're going to leave paragraph E the way it is, maintenance report needs to be something that gets defined before this goes into play, so that people know that they're not just signing their name saying, yep, we had it cleaned.
Photographic evidence would make it okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so is everybody okay with this?
Yes.
All right.
Again, I'm thinking of the contractor out there who's digging and trying to get stuff done, and, you know, sometimes you put a little of something together over here, you go over there because you need to get something else done before you back your way out, and I think I think if somebody comes out and looks at the system, the person should be able to look at it and say it's installed properly. If the guy goes out there and he looks at the hole in the ground, the hole isn't just going to stand there freely. There could be water in the ground. The cave-in could happen. I mean, there's other.
Okay, well, what would your solution be then?
Again, if sometimes you may need photographic, or you're going to cause more problems, and you're going to.
Okay, to clarify, photographs may still be involved.
Okay.
The reason I suggested getting photography out is I don't want somebody going, they did Brad's house, they had the inspector out, they took pictures all the way through it, and then, by golly, this is the same pictures I think I saw at Harriman's house when I did Thurston's house. Typically, the inspector is there. To the same point, there's always the guy that starts pouring the footings before the inspector's there for the footing inspection. But if you can see this half and understand, okay, well, what are the odds of them not turning the rebar in those two corners I didn't see? What are the odds of them not putting the stands under the rebar? What are the,
So what comes to mind is, okay, as a last case scenario, photographic evidence, and at the same time, the project has to show this micro area and the big picture of the property, so that way you at least know it happened on that property.
Correct. The reason I'm happy with the language the way F is that the enforcement officer or the engineer is involved in the discussion. As long as the inspector's there and says, look, because we had to do A, B, C, and D over here, we knew you were coming out for an inspection. We left this part open, but we had to cover up that site. We did this all this way. Here's a photo that shows that we did this over here before we covered it. Fine, I see it over here. Here's a photo. I now know what you're talking about, and I can tie the photo to reality. The inspector can sign off on it, as opposed to just a series of photos taken at random job sites that say, yep, we did it. That's why photo alone doesn't work. You have to get the conversation going to make sure it works, because otherwise people are going to skimp if they can.
I'm okay with that, but again, I think there are conditions where timing could be crucial, and
Absolutely.
at the last case scenario, somebody can take a picture of the subject area and the large picture area.
Yeah. By the same token, I didn't want this to be read that the inspector was going to stand there as each two-inch lift of crushed stone went in before the fabric.
Well, that's the way I read it.
Yeah. Good. That's the way I want the public to read it. Yeah.
Okay, let's see, moving on, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6,
Well, before you go forward, Kathy, on 2,
okay?
just a minor thing, in the end of that sentence, there should be a comma after solid waste.
Okay. All right. Okay, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then we get into the natural woodlands buffer standards. And there aren't any changes. Let's see. Where is the next change?
So the only one that pops up on my end is D, tree and sapling diameters shall be measured at 4.5 feet above the ground. I thought when Rob was here and we were doing the calipers, I think D it's a new add-on because generally when you measure a tree, if you're buying a tree from the nursery, it may not even be 4.5 feet tall, but you might have a 2.5-inch caliper on it. See what I'm saying? I mean, you might buy an evergreen tree, and it could be a 4 to 5 footer and not be 4 feet. So you're measuring, it's nothing at the top, when it's actually got a fat bottom on it, and the tree's going to grow.
Okay.
So
What are your suggestions?
my suggestion is to measure it at the base of the tree.
Don't these regulations basically follow the DES Shoreline Protection Act? So therefore, if we're changing that to something different, maybe that's not what we should do.
Oh, the regulations you have in front of you are all sorts of different from the state anymore.
For forestry purposes, trees are measured at 4.5 feet.
But do you understand what my
I understand completely. If it's something from a nursery, it's not going to be a foot in diameter.
Well, it's not going to, again, if you, and again, when you go to these people are going to go to the nursery, they're going to buy 4 to 5s, 5 to 6s. People aren't buying 10-foot tall trees because the cost of them is enormous.
Well, the existing paragraph says, tree and sapling diameter shall be measured at 4.5 feet above ground for existing trees and saplings, or by caliper at a height consistent with established nursery industry standards. So I agree, if you go out and you buy a 6-foot tall sugar maple that's at 2 inches, do you get credit for 2 inches, or do you get credit for the greater than 12 inches it's going to be?
No,
You're doing the caliber height then.
Well, exactly. So nursery standards would negate the 4.5 foot.
Yeah, I mean, I think this does address John's point.
my point is homeowners aren't buying trees that are going to measure greater than 3 inches at 4.5 feet tall. They're only going to be getting 1 point.
Yeah, I think the problem is the table. It says diameter or caliper. Because an existing tree is going to have a diameter to it. The nursery tree that they're planting to meet the score is going to have a caliper rating related to the ultimate diameter.
Well, then perhaps we need another column in that table so that diameter and caliper are separate and have different values for caliper.
Well, I think you've got that distinction in D. If it's existing, it's 4.5 feet. If you're buying nursery stock, it's going to be
They're the same
caliper.
thing. They're the same thing. When you go to the diameter, and diameter is the distance across, and the caliper is also the distance across.
Right, but if you buy a
but it's
2.5-inch
different
sugar
heights.
maple, it's going to be a 12-inch sugar maple in time. It's not going to stay a 2.5-inch sugar maple.
That would be true. That would be true of most trees that are that size, wouldn't it?
Well, right, but if you go, but to John's point, no one's going to go buy a 13-inch diameter sugar maple. I mean, I suppose you could. You'd only need 2 of them, and you're over your score. But you think of most of your shorefront property, how on earth are you going to get a tree, the tree down there?
And actually, that actually is adverse to it because they would only need 2 trees when we actually want many more trees.
Correct.
Okay, where do you want to go with this?
I think it says what we want it to say. I think, if you're looking at an existing tree, you measure it 4.5 feet up. If you're buying nursery trees, you measured it by caliper, and it's going to be at the bottom. If that's how they sell nursery stock, I've never bought any.
Yeah, Roger, I agree with you that that makes sense if we determine what the established nursery standard is, and I don't know what that is.
No, I don't know either.
Well, I bet the nursery could tell you.
Could we just omit it maybe and just use hours?
Well, the nursery standard measures at the
Yeah.
bottom.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, if the nursery standard is measured at the bottom, then, as Roger said, the way it's written now is fine.
Yeah, right.
Right, so you could go out on a completely devoid grid system and plant 25 one-inch saplings. There, grid score complete. I don't know if it's achieving what we want, but that would allow you to do that.
Yeah.
Just a note here, though, how am I supposed to know what nursery standard is? Because it doesn't say. Tells me that the big trees are 4.5 feet above the ground measured, but it doesn't say what the nursery standard is. We put in there at the bottom, measured at the bottom.
So the key word there is established nursery industry standard. So basically, they're saying, when this thing's fully matured, that's
inches above.
that's, when you open the book up, it says, you're buying this tree, it's 4 to 5 feet tall right now, it's going to be 50 feet tall, and it's going to be 12 inches to 20 inches around. The key word is established right there.
I don't think that's what this says.
I don't think it's what it says either. I think what this says is that if you're measuring nursery stock by caliper, and if the nursery standard is to measure by caliper at the base of the tree rather than 4.5 feet up, then that's where you're measuring it.
Yeah,
So
six
while you might-
inches. It's 6 inches up.
6 inches up?
Nursery is 6 inches.
So if it's 6 inches up, and it might measure, at 6 inches up, it might measure 2 inches across, and at 4.5 feet, it might measure a ½ inch across.
That's right.
But you're getting the wider version of it.
Okay, then take out sapling then on existing trees, because an existing tree is not a sapling.
Why not?
Because it's a small tree, it hasn't grown, it hasn't been established yet. So basically, you're measuring 4.5 feet off the ground on a tree that's already
You
existing.
said to put the base of the tree.
That's in the next sentence, or by caliper. That's why it makes it confusing, because one standard, you're measuring existing trees at 4.5 feet. So take out sapling, because that's not an existing tree, that's just still a small tree. And then caliper is a new tree measured at the bottom, like Steve says.
Let's change
But
that a
is
little
this-
bit more then, too, and say saplings or nursery stock measured 6 inches from the ground.
You could do
But
that.
that,
And
but
leave
that-
out the word caliper, which does not mean what you're saying it means to me.
Well, you need the word caliper, because that's the golden rule. That's what it's all measured by.
But this is divided up between things that exist and new plantings. And saplings should be measured 4.5 feet up.
So I just looked up the Oxford definition of sapling, and it's defined as a young tree. So I would agree with John that we can take out sapling and just say tree diameters, and it doesn't matter the age of the tree.
Existing
Right.
tree diameters.
Yes, correct.
But then what are you
Very good
doing with
suggestion.
saplings?
Do what
It's a tree.
Julie said, add it to the saplings or caliper trees measured at a height consistent with nursery standards.
Can we get rid of the word caliper, though? Caliper doesn't mean anything to me.
But it
If I'm
does
just
to the
reading-
person who's going to put the trees in and look at the plan.
Yeah.
Yes, but I have to tell the guy on the phone what I need, and if I don't know what the word means, I might not even say it.
Well, he's going to know more than you're going to know. That's-
You can also look up the word caliper in the dictionary.
It's a little tool.
Yes,
What does that have to do with measuring a tree at the bottom?
the
Or
caliper
when
measures
it's
the
50 years
distance.
old.
You put the caliper on the trunk, and
Yeah.
it measures the
But
diameter of the
John says it
trunk.
has to do with the mature trees.
So
you're
so
doing
this would be
in
my suggestion.
Estimating it at big.
When it says or, newly planted caliper or saplings.
Say that again?
You have to use the words, I have,
John, I would suggest that we can just say 4.5 feet above the ground for existing trees,
period.
period, diameter of existing trees, and the caliper of nursery stock or new plantings, however you want to describe it. I think we can take the word of sapling out of the entire paragraph and just either refer to existing trees or new plantings.
But then you're not, if you take out saplings, then you're not counting them in computing your score,
Why not?
because they're not existing trees or nursery stock.
Why are saplings not existing
A
trees?
sapling is a tree.
Well, so you're including them as existing trees.
Yeah, by definition, a sapling is a young tree. It's a subset of trees.
Okay, so that's saying the same thing that this currently says, or it has the same impact or effect.
That's right. I'm just trying to make it clearer by taking the word sapling out so we don't have the confusion between a tree and a sapling. It's just a tree.
So we measured the existing trees,
Period.
Yes?
period.
Did
And then we've
anyone,
got these other trees that are in buckets.
Yes?
Are we measuring them as to the measurement they are today?
They were
Correct.
Or
calibrated.
are we
Yes.
measuring them and imagining how big they are?
No, we're measuring today.
Existing.
So what does that have to do with consistent with established nursery?
all that means is where they measure it. The accepted
Okay.
practice is just where they measure it.
So today I want to measure this tree, and then the bucket tree, I want to measure it now, and add all those together to get the number that's on the scorecard here, the score.
Correct. Further, the existing trees are measured 4.5 feet off the ground, whereas the bucket trees are measured 6 inches off the ground.
Can we say that here somewhere?
I'm trying to figure this
That's-
out.
That's
So-
nursery stock.
Kind of what they're getting at.
Yeah, but me, you
So
know,
to the-
Jane,
No,
tear
I
out the
appreciate
hall.
what you're saying. And rather than saying existing nursery standards, we can just specify 6 inches from the
because we
base.
specified 4.5 feet up there, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Here I am trying to measure the little tree that's shorter than me, and it doesn't work.
So you have to take out established in consistent with established. You have to take out established because we're not talking about established trees in the second part. We're talking about new plantings.
But we're talking about established standards.
It was
and
under
under
nursery
the-
standards,
Talking
but
about established.
cross it out anyway.
Well, established is in the first part, should be measured, those are the trees that should be measured at 4.5 feet, established trees, okay?
No. The word established is only being used in reference to standards, not in reference to trees.
It goes with the next line down. But yes, cross it off anyway.
But when you're buying a new tree, it's not established, and you're measuring it by a caliper. So these are trees that you're buying at the nursery that are not established.
Okay, but we're not
But that's
using,
not what it
again,
says.
we're not using the word established in reference to trees. We're using the word established in reference to the standards.
Standards.
My suggestion is to cross it out anyway. Cross it out.
Well, you want it to be real nursery standards, which is what I think is intended here.
Yes, I
Nursery
agree.
standards are other words are fine. It doesn't have to be industry and all that other stuff. Nursery standards, because you're buying nursery stock.
Well, but we want to avoid the possibility of somebody going to a rogue nursery who typically measures stuff 1 inch off the ground or 3 feet off the ground.
Yeah, but I think you're going to have to do your own measurements to come up with your score, right?
We've done enough of
tape
this.
out?
We're going to see this again, okay?
I just add one thing, and that is the Shoreland Water Quality Protection Act defines sapling means any wooded plant which normally grows to a mature height greater than 20 feet and has a diameter less than 6 inches at a point 4.5 feet above the ground.
Thank you for adding that, Roger.
Okay, under diameter or caliper, previously, we did change that, 3 inches and
We
greater
added the
than 3
greater
inches.
than, less than.
Yeah,
Yep.
right.
John
Okay,
Rourke.
so that's all in. Okay, shrubberies and dead, terminally diseased or structurally unsafe trees, shrubs, and ground cover shall not be included in the scoring.
So that brings up one of the topics that persisted for a while, does the board have interest in qualifying or otherwise determining who makes the call on dead, quote, terminally diseased or structurally unsafe? Are we leaving this to insurance carriers, nervous homeowners, foresters, arborists? Because I've been approached by all of them.
But if it's not included in the scoring, isn't the idea to get the score to a certain
Well,
number?
it's not about, for the most common phone call has nothing to do with somebody that's doing a shorefront application. They have a tree that they determine or have determined dangerous because they're tired of it blocking their view.
True.
Or it has a dead branch on it.
And it's
Or
diseased.
it happens to be one that loses its leaves 3 months after the other, so something must be wrong with it, therefore it's terminally diseased and therefore has to go. Or it gets its leaves earlier. But my point is, there was a lot of discussion, I think one of the last times I went to Wolfeboro Waters, was who makes that call? Because that call was made by,
Well, that's why the last sentence in the previous thing says, if any of these are removed, the property must still conform to the established natural woodlands buffer standards established by the ordinance. So
where's that last sentence?
That was in the old
it's not
version.
in
July.
Rich's, this Rich's, but it was in previously. And
But
that,
even if they're removed, isn't the idea to get
well,
the
wait.
score high? So you have to plant more
If-
stuff?
no, we're just supposed to have as much vegetation as we
Right, that's what I
can.
just said.
Yeah,
So if they,
yeah, the goal is typically for a homeowner to get the score high, but
Right.
we want the score to be high with
Big things.
viable tree. No, not
Yeah.
big, but viable. If you have a dead tree, you don't want to include it in the score, right?
no, but what I'm saying is, does it really make any difference to the score or to us if the homeowner thinks that's pretty dead and we say, it's really not dead, but they really want it down, so they're going to hire somebody to take it down? Does it really make any difference if they get their score high enough by planting new stuff?
Well,
If they
it
still
might-
meet the ordinance, yeah, that's what you're saying, right?
Yes, what she's
Yeah,
saying is that
yeah, right.
if the score is still high enough without that offending tree.
Yeah, that's the
Yeah.
goal, right?
Right,
Right.
yeah.
So-
But what D is saying is if it's dead, terminally diseased, or structurally unsafe, it doesn't count anyway. There are instances where it might be the only tree in the grid. People are not going to go, I mean, it doesn't seem appropriate to make somebody plant 25 one-inch trees, caliper inch, however you want to get there, because there happened to be a dead tree there. I'm not talking about those that want to remove it for the view, but if the tree is dead,
It's coming down in the
can't
wind
be
anyway.
counted.
it's not counted anyway, but the earlier draft says, but it has to meet the score. And then you have to evaluate whether you could even put trees there. And then some people would look at it and say, well, if the one tree that's there is dead, probably it doesn't support trees. I mean, there are just some environments that don't support trees.
Okay, but you still have to conform to the natural woodlands buffer standards.
Not if it's dead, you don't. It says it right there.
No, it does at the end of,
Which draft are you looking at?
well, I'm looking
Today's
at
or the old one?
The 718, that one, and this, it was removed on this one. It says, if any of these are removed, the property must still conform to the established natural buffers, woodlands buffer standards.
Right, and I remember the discussion we had back in July about
What
that
if it doesn't
sentence.
already have it
And the point was that this whole section requires that they meet the woodland
Yeah.
buffer score. So having that sentence in F there is redundant, I would say.
Well,
Yes.
a
Very
reminder to
redundant.
people that that's what you're supposed to do.
But you
That's
don't,
what the rest of
you
it
don't
says.
have to have it if you don't have it.
Yeah, Tavis has a good point on that, you know, if you have 2 trees and one of them's dead and you cut it down, you don't have to plant 24 more trees.
Right.
No, but I think what you sometimes get into is somebody says, my tree that's 20 inches around is being suffocated by bittersweet, so therefore it's dead, and I'm going to cut it down. So then they cut it down, and then they don't replace it with anything because nobody's out there. Or a birch tree that's got black ants in it that's eating the sun out of it, and it's got 3 branches that are dead on it. They think it's dead, so they just go to cut it down, and it's a point tree.
I can tell you what's been going on because there was an instance where a predecessor of mine made a call. So since then, every time somebody said, hey, can you come look at my tree? I said, no, what does your forester say? What does your arborist say? Now, obviously, people in that line of work are motivated by being able to remove the tree. But I don't just say, is it or isn't it? I say, what are you basing that on? Many in town are able to say, do you see this? Do you see this? And then I can go back and either look at Google or myforestry.com and figure, okay, now I see what you're talking about. Yes, that appears to be, I don't know what terminally diseased means. I've never come across a tree with cancer.
Yeah, you're looking at them all over town, the ash trees, terminally diseased.
Well, those are structurally unsafe, actually.
That too.
Okay, so does everybody want to leave it as it is in Rich's?
I think the current version makes the most sense, but I think we need to think a little bit longer about who makes that call. I don't think that should be left to
The homeowner.
well, definitely not the homeowner. I was going to say the building official or the planner. I think I don't want to say appropriately licensed because that sparked a long discussion earlier, but we need to think about, included but not limited to arborists, foresters.
Yeah.
You say tree
Rich is
professional.
One of the early versions was to have the town forester look at it. And if the town forester made it, that's a very easy one.
Can you say tree professional?
Yeah?
That takes in firewood all the way up to,
Yeah, but I don't think A1 firewood is a tree professional.
Well, you could
Okay,
say,
but the tree warden is not a bad idea.
yeah.
So something to think, I'm not trying
Yeah.
to stall it now, but it's something to think about moving forward.
Okay. All right, down to C. There's no changes here. And just the change in the diameter caliper on the next page. And all of these things to do with the trees and counting and everything, we really went into that in great depth last time, I think. Okay, I think that's a lot redevelopment.
So page 6, paragraph 3, immediately below the table. I haven't thought about modified language, but people have come to me and suggested creatively that a circuitous 6-foot wide path that passed and repassed would technically meet the definition and allow you to effectively have a footpath that covered your entire 50-foot frontage. So my point is something along the lines of a footpath that provides direct access or non-circuitous access.
Well, you're also trying not to concentrate stormwater.
Correct. So it works to your benefit to have it have some switchbacks in it, but at what point do you put so much walkway in that you've negated the 50 feet?
And why would people want to put a circuitous walkway in?
If you put a walkway that goes all the way that way and then comes all the way back, you effectively have a road that goes across the 50 feet. It's all one path, but if it loops back on itself, if it happens to be, tire width apart, you effectively have a road going through the 50-foot buffer.
Well, you probably don't need the second one. You've already got access to your dock, beach, or structure.
you do now.
I think you're missing it. If you draw them back and forth, you still have one path.
Just make it a
But
single.
that wasn't the intent, because I was in the
that
committee meeting with
why-
Montrone, and Montrone, the state allowed you to have a 6-foot wide path to the beach.
Correct.
And then Montrone added 6-foot wide path to the dock from the beach. So that's what it is. It's not a path to the dock and to the beach side by side. It's one, then from one to the other, 6-foot wide still.
I'll bring an illustration of what I'm talking about.
I know exactly what you're saying, because you showed me the property where the guy wanted to get down to the shorefront. He said he'd build both of them right next to each other and call it 12 feet wide.
Correct. It's technically one path, but just by virtue of the six switchbacks, you have a road.
But the intent was 6-foot wide path to the beach, and from the beach to the dock.
I agree. Intent is one thing, what it says is different. So we
So
need
how
to
do we
match.
make it say that?
That's why I'm suggesting I will come up with some
okay,
suggestions on how to
good.
do that.
Make it
I
a
think
single
your use
path.
of the word direct is a good
Yes.
strategy.
So I'd like to back up to number 8, actually, where it says only low phosphorus, slow release nitrogen can be used beyond 25 feet of the reference line. No phosphorus, 0, not low.
I don't know how we regulate this. I understand the point of putting it in the regulations, but I don't know how we track this.
I don't know how either.
Because you're
but-
at the top of page 7, right?
Because,
Yeah.
and the next sentence, no fertilizer may be used within 25 feet. I use chicken. It's not even fertilizer, but it is fertilizer because it's food. And food is fertilizer. So you can put chicken down because it's all organic. It's feathers and byproduct. It's organic. It's just, so it's a fertilizer. It's a food. So we're.
Right. My point is, we don't have a permit process for fertilizer.
I get it. So if you
So
want,
to me, number 8 is a speed limit sign with no police department.
so we can take it out.
Well, no, I think it's encouraged as guidance,
Right.
but
Okay. So where's the happy medium? I just gave you the option.
Well, I can tell you that I called a former codes officer on the condominium across from my office on Back Bay where the guy was spreading fertilizer, and the lawn care company got a visit from the codes officer.
So
And a
you can,
reminder.
yeah.
so you can spread
That
lime.
we can, I mean, enforce,
So Roger,
complaint-based is easy.
if you see somebody with a spreader, you don't know what they're spreading. Legally, they can spread lime. Lime comes in a granule, it comes in a powder, and so you don't know what they're really spreading. The organics, the chicken comes in stuff that just looks like chunks of stuff. So you don't know if I'm spreading Jonathan Green or I'm spreading chicken. So just,
Well, I think you may be spreading fertilizer in violation of this provision. I mean, my vegetable garden has always used organic methods, and I grow all sorts of stuff. And I would not want to be doing that next to a body of water.
I mean, to Roger's point, yes, having it in here, if somebody sees somebody doing something, it can generate a letter and a site visit, et cetera.
So can we cross off the first line that says only low phosphorus and just keep the no fertilizer? Blanket statement, no fertilizer may be used within 25 feet.
What's the harm in keeping the first sentence?
Why bother?
Because it gives people guidance?
that's, and it's really the most important part. That's what our backbone of all our regulations, no phosphates. That's
Well,
the,
then, let's
Well,
switch them
especially
around
if you're
then.
having people put in 25-plus saplings in a compromised area, they might want something.
Something, well, then switch it around then, because you're starting with kind of like, oh, well, don't worry about it, and then trying to hit hard at the end. You need to hit the hard thing of the no at first, so they're like, oh, no fertilizer with it.
So
And
no
then as they continue
fertilizer,
to-
no fertilizer may be used within 25 feet of the reference line. An exception would be a
And
low
then-
phosphorus, slow release nitrogen fertilizer.
I would add chemical fertilizers if you want to clarify. No chemical fertilizers.
I would use
Inorganic.
no fertilizer, and under the Act, no fertilizer shall be applied to vegetation or soils located within 25 feet of the reference line.
But if you're But if you're planting a new tree, you want to make sure it goes, so therefore you may want to have some fertilizer in that area.
Then you're violating the ordinance.
I mean, if you want to split that hair, Peter, you're correct. You have to plant the tree. It doesn't say it has to live.
Can you put a dead fish in with
And,
it?
and there again, when you talk about people's shorelines, again, the shoreline is the grass. It filters the water before it gets into the lake. If you don't have something filtering, then you're just carrying everything right off into the lake. And if you're not doing something to promote an established grass area, you're growing weeds. And again, I've said weeds are just a single stem, and they're doing nothing for anybody because spreading more invasive species. So there's a balance there of creating something that works for you. And filters, that's the number 2 of the golden rule, infiltration and filtration.
But grass really doesn't do that very well.
What's that?
Grass does not do that very well.
Grass is the number 1 filter, Roger.
I guess my concern is what Roger just read from the statute. If the statute only has the second sentence, it doesn't mention the second sentence, I don't know if the regulation should purport something that isn't supported by statute.
Well, it says beyond 25 feet, slow or controlled release fertilizer as defined by rules adopted by the department may be used.
Okay, so both of these sentences do match, okay.
I think if you read down there, it will say organic fertilizers are permitted. I know I've gone through that book, but.
Okay, so we discussed this enough?
I think so.
I think so, too. And then lot redevelopment.
So what are you going to do? Are you going to leave it there?
Yes.
Tavis is going to be reviewing all of this, and it will come back to us
Okay.
again. Okay.
Yep.
I mean, my inclination
So
to
people
answer your
have a chance
question
to
is
think
yes,
about
because
this.
both sentences are coming effectively from the statute, so.
I agree with the idea of switching the priority to make the 25-foot reference line first.
Steve, could you bring your mic closer?
I agree that we should put the stricter sentence first.
Nothing within 25, and beyond 25, you can use only low phosphorus.
That's the way the statute's written.
Yep.
And we could even put the reference in there.
Okay, anything on lot redevelopment? Okay. So I think the next step is for you to go through this. You were going to send something to the surveyors and engineers, and I'll also ask them about their definition of impervious, because they really should be following the state statute.
Any thoughts? I know you're trying to move on. Bottom of page 7 goes into E with a series of definitions. Does the board want to carry on past trend of moving definitions to definitions, or leave them here where they are?
I'd leave them where they are.
I agree, leave them where they are.
Yeah, I would too.
Kathy, just on your impervious surface, it means any modified surface that cannot effectively absorb or infiltrate water. And then it says examples of impervious surface, and those are the ones you listed.
I thought we were supposed to be moving all definitions to definitions, though. That's what we were trying to do last year, is move definitions to definitions.
If you have definitions that just apply to one section, you should put them there and not make people go on a search.
It would be nice to maybe have them in 2 places then, so that when we look up definitions in the definitions section, we can find it. You know, and oh, by the way, we put it at the bottom of the chapter too.
Let me see your agenda.
But to me, it makes sense that when you go to a definitions chapter, that they're all there,
Are you stealing it?
personally.
I got 2 of them.
Oh, do you?
No. 9th.
Oh, okay, so Tavis is going to relook at this and bring it back to us.
In italics, red and green.
Yeah,
The first step is to take this document, and Rich may already have this, but take the existing language, turn it into a track change that became what you looked at tonight. And then there'd be a new track change modifying that in a different color. I don't like red and green because it's too early for Christmas, but I get the
We can
idea.
have blue.
Okay, if we could just quickly, let's skip over the half bath on the ground floor and do the ADU regulations, because this is really rather simple, and it has nothing to do with anything other than trying to get our regulations in sync with each other. The accessory dwelling application does not say anything about a site visit.
Perfect.
But then, and Roger, thanks for finding this and reminding us that there is a section under conditional use permit criteria, and it does talk about the board going and reviewing. Are you leaving before the public comment? This is
Not as much as it was stormwater.
It really is. So what the proposal is to either add this site visit for the accessory dwelling unit and take it out of this conditional use permit. I mean, we can add all of this, I think, to the accessory.
Well, yeah, and one of the reasons I thought this warranted discussion is I cannot find clear and concise documentation.
Okay, but it's here in the ordinance, and I'm just trying to fix it, okay? So that it's clear to people who are trying to use it.
Understand.
Yeah, okay. And I get it that you don't think it was done properly, but, I mean, do people want to view these accessory dwelling units? And if you do, could we put it into the accessory dwelling unit ordinance? That's all this is about in my mind.
Well, I think given the infrequency in which people apply for ADUs, it's not a burden upon us to go and view the site.
Okay, do you...
When you say go and view the
Put it
site,
in-
is
Could
this-
we put it into the accessory dwelling unit section of the regulation, or is that too cumbersome? Because here we do have these, the conditional use permit criteria.
Now you say site, go to the site and look at the site. Does this mean that we're going inside someone's existing home to see what they want to convert? Or
No.
does this mean walk around the house?
Right, it means to walk around the house, I think.
So to what purpose does that?
Well, I don't know, there were several of us here when this ordinance was adopted, if anybody can remember. I honestly cannot.
Because if we're taking an existing building and carving out an ADU on the inside, since we can't make detached yet,
Well, that's why I'm bringing it up.
But it doesn't have to be carved out on the inside. It could be something that is added onto the existing building on the outside
Yeah.
right, so why would we make a site visit?
to
That would
see
be
if
new
the site is
construction.
suitable
Because it's
for.
in the ordinance is why we would do it.
I think the
Okay?
other thing,
And I'm just trying to find out if people want to do it or don't want to do it.
I think in terms of the Libby Street ADU proposal, it would have been helpful. I mean, I did go look at it, but I think it would be helpful in that case. In some of the cases, it may not make as much difference, but I would be in favor of doing it. You just do it before the meeting.
My input is that I think if you're trying to address, I mean, I have a completely separate question, 175-215A1. I don't know what adequate usable space is because that's not something that comes up. That's not a criteria in any of our zones. We don't have required open space for multifamily. We don't have required usable area anywhere else in the zone anywhere else in the zoning other than an ADU. effectively, most of the ordinance refers to it in terms of lot coverage and setback. So if you meet lot coverage and setback, by default, you would meet adequate usable space. Going further, A2 talks about adequate access. Adequate access in generic terms, I think you could determine by looking at the site plan, but I think you're really looking at A2 to answer C.
What are you referencing again? 175-210?
So on the ADU sheet that you have in your packet, John,
15.
Yeah.
it's a one pager.
Okay, if this isn't going to be an easy discussion, I would
Okay.
say let's I
continue.
mean, it seems like
Well,
it isn't
the
going to be.
simple question is, should we move it from 175-215 into 175-57.1? I think that's an easy
you're on this
discussion.
side.
But I think the board needs to think about if all of it moves or some of it moves, and that might take longer to discuss.
Okay. All right. Okay, let's skip over the bath ground floor and go to public comments. Okay, I told you it would be sort of quick, and it wasn't.
So just two quick comments on the discussion of the stormwater, or the shoreline protection regulation. The first one has to do with 175-67.
Are we looking at your version?
Yes,
Yeah, okay.
that's the only version I
Yeah,
have.
okay.
175-67, A1, the note, right? And that whole discussion about square footage and percentage and everything. I think it's important to remember what that note is about. What we're trying to determine is what's the trigger that requires a property owner to provide a somewhat formal estimate or definition of how much impervious cover their property has, right? So what came up in the discussion on July 18th was, and I think Tavis brought it up, was initially the thrust of the discussion was we can't have people anybody providing their own assessment of how much impervious cover they have. And so Wolfeboro Waters said, you need something a little bit more formal. Tavis's question was, do we want to require that for any and every proposed project? Some of them can be so small, a deck or something like that. Do we really want to require them to have a formal estimate of their impervious cover? And the consensus, as I heard it, reflected in that note, was that no, there should be some sort of threshold that a project should cross before we require them to have a formal indication of their impervious cover. And so the 225, as somebody noted, sort of was my first stab. I think numbers somewhere in that area may have come up on July 18th. So I'm just putting a number in. It's for the board to decide. But basically what you're trying to decide here is who has to provide a formal assessment of their impervious cover and who doesn't. That being the case, I don't know how you could make this anything but square footage. There was some suggestion that we might use percentage here, but the whole point is you don't know the percentage yet of impervious cover. That's the whole point of having this threshold, right? That you don't know what it is, and if you fall below this threshold, we will accept your numbers. If you go beyond that threshold, whatever it is you want it to be, then you must provide a more formal definition of how much impervious cover you have. So if I'm understanding this whole discussion correctly, nothing but square footage works here. You can't talk about percentages when, in fact, the whole discussion is about, do we force people to, to even provide a formal estimate of percentage? That would be my only point, that the only thing that makes sense here is square footage, whatever that number is that you set, okay? Otherwise than that, what percentages are we even talking about? That would be my first one. The second one has to do with the point that Tavis brought up, which is that the proposal before you from Wolfeboro Waters eliminates the provision that says if you don't increase the amount of impervious cover in a project, or you reduce it by, was it 1%? Is that what it is? You don't have to do a storm water management plan. You don't basically have to deal with your stormwater runoff. And I think the point we've tried to make repeatedly on this discussion is that it focuses on the wrong issue. It focuses on how you got to your particular percentage of impervious cover rather than what the impact of that cover is. Does it really matter whether your grandfather, did things to the property that brought it up to 28% impervious cover, whereas your next door neighbor, he just built a garage that brought his property up to 28%. What we're saying in making that provision, for no increase, is that if, let's say, I have, because my grandfather put it there, have 1,000 square feet of paved parking area next to my house, I decide I'm going to build a 1,000 square foot garage on there. If you put in the provision or retain the one that's in there now, basically, no matter what percentage of impervious cover I've got on that property, I don't have to do anything about the stormwater runoff from that project, from that garage project. You, on the other hand, live next to me. Your grandfather left some seeded, some grassy area there. You put up 1,000 square foot garage, brings your property up to 28% impervious cover, and you are obliged to deal with the stormwater runoff from that. So basically, what we're saying is it makes a difference of how you got to 28%. If you had it there all along because that's what Granddad did, you're off the hook. If you go ahead and put something up there, you need to deal with it. Arguably, those two properties with the same amount of impervious cover have the same impact on the adjacent water. And so that's why it doesn't make sense to allow people to simply say, I didn't make any change. What makes sense is if you put up a project, you should deal with the runoff from it. It doesn't matter if your property was already at X level. What matters is that you are starting a project that will have an impact, even though it's the same impact that was there before, and you should be obliged to do the same thing as your next door neighbor who created a new project. They're at the same level of impervious cover. They arguably have the same impact on the surface waters, and you should deal with them the same way. That would be my point.
Okay, so you're talking about C, right?
He's talking about the one that's not in it, the
That's right.
1%.
The one
Yes, I'm talking about
1%.
the one that,
Yeah, okay.
that was
but C
removed.
also, okay.
That would be our argument.
That would be
Okay.
D, I think.
So to that end, if the board is curious, The question that I have following that, and I agree with the premise that Rich put forward, but that's the same problem we have with all nonconforming structures and nonconforming everything. So I want to make sure from the legal side that the town has the ability to do that. Because the examples that were given were 1,000 square feet of paved parking area getting a garage versus grass getting a garage. Those are not equal statements because one was impervious and one was pervious. And the change. I understand the net impact of 30%, or 28% going into the lake is one thing. But if you have 1,000 square feet of paved surface that's draining into the lake unfettered, do you or do you not have the same right to have the same 1,000 square feet of coverage draining into the lake? Or because we adopted a regulation sometime after Grandpa, are you exempt from that? And that's a legal question that I think needs clarification before the board decides on that finally.
I think what we were hitting on was the threshold of the new structure, because I think that's why I asked that question. Should there be a threshold of like, okay, you meet the less than percentage of lot coverage, but you're going to build a new garage to stay under it. So if you build a new garage, it's over 750 square feet, that would trigger you to have to do the stormwater.
Correct. Yeah, my hang up with the existing paragraph is it says if you're greater than 30 and reduce it by 1%, you're off the hook entirely.
Okay.
To that agreement, I think that's completely.
Okay, Rich, did you have anything else you wanted to? Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, can we just quickly go through the minutes of September 5th? I'm sorry, Ann, would you like to, Ann, did you want to speak? I'm sorry. Okay, thank you. Oh.
I find no fault with the minutes.
Okay, everybody with the minutes? I'll make a motion to approve the September 5th, 2023 minutes.
On page 1, Peter Goodwin should be listed as a member and Steve Webster as the alternate. They're just reversed.
Oh, yes, right, okay. Okay.
And then on page 9, it has Vaughn seconding the motion to approve the O'Hare special use permit. Did you second that? Vaughn, I know you voted against it.
Which one was this, Roger?
Page 9, the O'Hare Enterprises. Top of the page.
Mm-hmm.
It says Vaughn seconded the motion, but then she voted against it.
I think she actually did.
Yeah, she did.
That's what I remember.
That could be.
Anything else, Roger?
Well, I just had a question. There are a number of C attached. And does that mean we have that information that we received in our packets or from the applicant? Does that mean those various things are attached to the minutes in the
So
file?
the minutes that are posted online are actually 66 pages. And what it is everything that was received at the meeting, the 16 pages from Bruce, all of that is attached as part of the minutes online. But instead of putting 66 pages for all of you, I said, let's focus on the minutes of the meeting, and I'll explain at the meeting that all the attachments are, in fact, posted online.
I'm certainly not complaining you did that.
I sort of read through them.
You want to second that?
I'll second Kathy's motion.
As amended,
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
abstain.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, folks,
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
all in favor? Aye. Okay, thank you, John. There's your agenda back.